Thank you, Janice. Some years ago, we took our kids to the zoo in Asheboro for the first time. And while we were there, Caroline was telling me about one of her first memories going to the zoo as a little girl back in school. And they had gone to her elementary school to the Asheboro Zoo, and they were approaching the gorilla exhibit. And in case you're not aware, gorillas are like crazy strong. I mean, their fingers are, they're just huge. I mean, they're bigger than the hot dogs at Costco. And so, anyway, they're approaching the gorillas, and the teacher, as Caroline is recounting the story, tells them, the tour guides that are with them as well, say, whatever you do, don't stick your tongue out at the gorilla. So you just told a bunch of kids, don't stick your tongue out at the gorilla. So you got to stick your tongue out at the gorilla. Well, the silverback apparently decides, I will not stand for this insolence from all these little children, and runs up and this bulletproof glass hits the glass so hard that it cracks the glass. Children are scared to death, and this has left an indelible memory on Caroline's life. Anyway, fast forward, Caroline's telling me that story. This past year, she has gone with Peter's class to the zoo for a field trip. And so they need a number of moms to assist with this. She is walking with another mother, and at this point, they're walking to the chimpanzee exhibit, which also has bulletproof glass so that you can get up close and personal and see them. Anyway, so she's just told this mother about the experience with the gorilla, blah, blah, blah. They're there to see the chimpanzees. And Caroline is just kind of standing back, and this other mother is in front of her so that she can't really see her. And as she's standing there, all of a sudden, one of the chimpanzees charges the glass and starts beating on the glass, scaring all the kids to death. Caroline said to the mom, you didn't stick your tongue out at the monkey, did you? I stuck my tongue out at the monkey. And so this other mother has, why does she do that? Why does she do that? And so it leads you to think, what would cause someone, after hearing something like this, to do that? Well, part of you would say that there's a reason for it, and it's just the curiosity factor. Might something happen? So, curiosity, we're told, killed the cat, and so just sheer human curiosity might have motivated this other mom to stick her tongue out at the chimpanzees. But there's ultimately, I think, a greater reason as to why something like that would happen, and that's this, that she made an assessment. She was thinking about the possibilities here, and the assessment was based on expectation, that even if I do this, whatever the response is, it's not going to either be of significance, certainly not going to scare all the kids to death, not going to be any big deal. And so there was this assessment based on expectation. And it turns out that what she anticipated, what she expected, was far more significant than she ever thought. It was just a little small thing. Just sticking your tongue out at the monkeys will cause them to go crazy. Write that in your Bibles. Do not stick tongue out at monkeys. You say, well, what does that have to do with anything? It has to do with this thought. There are regularly in life decisions and choices that you make about things that you are going to do. And specifically as a follower of Christ, there are instances where you are making decisions and choices about things that you're going to do, and many times, whether or not it is, that you actually disobey God. Am I going to operate in bounds, or am I going to do what I want to and cross the line that God has erected? Am I actually going to sin? As you make that assessment, as the calculus is going on in your minds, one of the things that you're going to do is to make that decision based on what you anticipate, what you expect is going to happen. And those expectations, if they're low enough, may very well lead you to go ahead and cross the line. Now, we've been working our way through the life of David. And last week, Jamie led you to look at the passage where David commits some sin that really is at the high water mark. And so he has committed adultery with Bathsheba. He seeks to cover that up by ultimately having her husband murdered. So adultery and murder, you're aware that's on the top 10 list, right? These are things that God has said, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder. And David's done both of them. That's big stuff. That's big stuff. Now, when you think about David's life, and if I were to ask you before this message started, hey, what are the sins that David committed that had the most consequence? Likely, most of you would say, or many of you would say, well, it is the adultery and the murder. Good night. That's the top 10 list. Let me just tell you that because of the adultery and murder, 2 people died. Uriah, who's the victim of the murder, and the child that was conceived from the adultery. 2 people died. The thing that David did, disobeying God, that had the greatest consequence was conducting a census, numbering, counting people, and 70,000 died. How could that be? How is it that David would wind up doing something seemingly as small, as insignificant as counting people, and it result in such great loss? How is that possible? How is it that seems to be so small, so insignificant? Well, the reason that David does this is the same reason that you and I may do things that we think to be insignificant. And that is that we will have expectations about the result of, or the consequence, or the effect of our decisions, and we'll think them to be so small that we can just go ahead and cross that line without there being anything of gravity occurring. So today, in response to that, we want to think about this question, which has real practical application. What expectations might I have? What expectations might you have that would lead us, that might lead you to choose sin? You're at the crossroads point. You're deciding, am I going to do this? Am I going to do that? Am I going to say this? Am I going to think that? Am I going to look this up? Whatever. The decision that you're making, what expectations might you have that could lead you actually to disobey God? Look with me in 2 Samuel chapter 24. 2 Samuel 24. Excuse me, we're going to look at the first 10 verses. 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, we're told that the Lord's anger burned against Israel again, and he stirred up David against them to say, go count the people of Israel and Judah. So the king said to Joab, the commander of his army, go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register the troops so that I can know their number. That's a census. Count all the military-aged guys. Verse 3, Joab, that's the commander, he replies to the king, may the Lord multiply the troops 100 times more than they are, while my lord the king looks on. But why does my lord the king want to do this? Yet the king's order prevailed over Joab and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army left the king's presence to register the troops of Israel. They crossed the Jordan, camped in Aroer. Isn't that a great name? Aroer. South of the town in the middle of the valley, and then proceeded toward Gad and Jazer. They went to Gilead and to the land of the Hittites and continued on to Dan, Jan, and around to Sidon. They went to the fortress of Tyre and all the cities of the Hivites and Canaanites. Afterward, they went to Negev of Judah at Beersheba. When they had gone through the whole land, they returned to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days, so almost 10 whole months of counting. Joab gave the total of the registration of the troops. There were 800,000 valiant armed men from Israel and 500,000 men from Judah. Verse 10, David's conscience troubled him after he had taken a census of the troops, and he says this, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, because I've been very foolish, please take away your servant's guilt. There's more to the story, and we'll unpack that in a moment. But ultimately, this passage answers that question for us, because what was true for David is true for me, it's true for you. There are expectations that we can have that if that's our expectation, I'm telling you, it's going to lead you regularly and frequently to disobey God. Well, what are those expectations? Well, the first one I would say to you is this. I expect the guilt to be bearable. So if by crossing this line, I do what God has said not to, if I feel guilt over that, the guilt will be bearable. Won't be any big deal. All right, so let's set the stage as to what's going on at this point. David has been the king of Israel now for some time. And obviously in the rearview mirror, he's had some really, really bad decisions. He's had some good ones, but he's had some really bad ones that you just looked at last week between the adultery and the murder, all that. That's terrible. That being said, though, David's reign and his leadership as the king of Israel has led the nation to experience a level of achievement and prosperity and growth and just splendor that they have never experienced before. So that's going good. But then we're told in verse 1 that the Lord's anger has stirred against Israel again. We don't know what's going on exactly. We don't know exactly what the detail is, what the specific is, but it seems that there's something that's going on where the people of God aren't really acting like the people of God, and they are operating in disobedience and operating in ways that don't please God. And so we're told that God's anger is stirred against them. Now, or that it burned against them. And then we're told in verse 1 that God stirred up David against them. That's Israel to say, go count the people of Israel. So look at that very clearly. God stirs up David against Israel to say, go count the people of Israel. Right? You're aware that many passages in the Bible, certainly in the New Testament, but in particular some of these Old Testament narratives, there are parallel passages where you have the same incident that's described. We have this same incident described in 1 Chronicles 21. In verse 1 of 1 Chronicles 21, it says this: Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. Did you hear the difference? 1 Chronicles 21 says, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So 1 Samuel says, the Lord's anger burned, and he, that's God, stirred up David against them to say, go count the people. 1 Chronicles says, who did it? The devil did it. 2 Samuel says, who stirred? Well, God stirred. Well, which is it? How is it that you reconcile that? Because hopefully you can see that's a clear distinction. I mean, it's either God does this or the devil does this. So how do we reconcile this? Let me just say, candidly, it's not especially easy, but there's some things that we have to keep in mind. One of which is this, that there is never an instance where God is not in control. And so because of that, there is nothing ultimately that ever happens that God doesn't in some way, directly or indirectly, green light. You may not like that, but that's the reality, because either God is in control and he is sovereign or he's not. And so there's no partial sovereignty. And so God is and has been and remains in control. What I believe is going on here is this, that God is angered at Israel because of their disobedience, and he intends on bringing judgment, consequence to bear to get their attention, to get them back in line. That's the ultimate plan and aim of God. I believe also individually in David's heart, you have Satan coming to say, hey, you ought to do a census. You ought to count the people. And what was the motivation behind that? Perhaps to say, look at what we've got. Look at our big, fat, massive army. Look at all the strength that we have. Maybe it was that he could, because of that, really take pride in his accomplishment. Or maybe it is to launch a military conquest because of what he believed to be their numerical strength. We don't know. But whatever it is, I do believe that Satan is working in the heart of David, tempting him to do this. And as David is wagering, as he is evaluating, as he is contemplating making this decision, I believe that he marches towards that line, and then God effectively confirms that decision. Because I think you even have in this passage Romans 8:28 at work, that God is using all things together for good, to accomplish his good purpose. His good purpose in the life of Israel was, in this case, I believe, to bring discipline into their circumstance to get them back in line. And what we see here is God even using David's sin, David's disobedience, his failure in response to temptation, he's using that bad to accomplish the good. That's how I reconcile the two. Anyway, so we have David weighing this idea about whether or not he's going to conduct a census. And so you think, well, what's the big deal with counting people in the first place? I mean, we do that in our family all the time. We get somewhere when it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and we just count to 100. Anyway, so like, well, what's the big deal with counting people? Well, in the scheme of things, there wasn't necessarily a problem, except there were a couple of criteria that needed to be met. One of which is that according to Numbers 1, this would be something that God needed to say, count the people. And then based on Exodus 30, if a census was to be conducted, all of those that were counted for military service would have to offer what's known as a ransom. And this ransom was an offering in case there was some sort of ceremonial uncleanness that they had. When it seems that both of those requirements are not met here. God didn't say do this, and this prescribed ransom has not been offered to the Lord. It seems also that Joab knows this shouldn't be done, or at least shouldn't be done the way that it is. Why? Now, who is Joab? Joab is David's military commander. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he's like, hey, David, this is not a good idea. But he doesn't come out and say, Your Majesty, please don't do this. He's saying, oh, may God multiply by 100 how many we have. There's just really no need to do this. He's trying to use reverse psychology. And in doing so, I think it is clear Joab doesn't want to have this census conducted because Joab knows it's wrong. I think David knows that it's wrong. It seems also because we're told that the king's order prevailed not only against Joab, but against the commanders. So you have the other generals, the other officers are like, I don't think we should be doing this. Everybody, it seems, knows that this is going on, but David decides we're going to have the census. We're going to count the people. God didn't say to do it, even though that's how it's supposed to operate. The ransom is supposed to be given, even though we're not going to do that. But I want it. I want it anyway. I'm going to stick my tongue out at the monkeys. So he's done this, and it takes just shy of 10 months to count all the people. 10 months. And I don't believe that detail is given to us accidentally. I think it's given to us because it's indicating at any point David could have stopped this. He could have said, you know what, I've acted out of line, but he doesn't. Days pass, weeks pass, months pass, almost 10 months pass before finally the tally comes back in about how many troops there are, what the results of the census are. And as soon as it comes in, there's 800,000 in Israel, there's 500,000 in Judah, 1.3 million standing men that could be armed and to serve in the military. Does David at that point say, man, look at me, look at my big fat army, look at our... Does he feel great? No, look at verse 10. It says that his conscience troubled him. The word that's used there literally means that he was struck in his heart. And notice this, when he responds to God, he says, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. There are 6 times in the Bible where David confesses sin to God, 6 of them. When, for example, he confesses to God the fact that he has committed adultery and murder, he says this, I have sinned. When he confesses this, the act of counting people, this is the only time he uses the word greatly. I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Why do you think he is saying that here? I think it has everything to do with the guilt, candidly, that he is experiencing. How he is feeling is not how he thought he was going to feel. The internal experience, the turmoil that he's feeling inside, it is so weighty, and he didn't expect that was going to happen. I'm just going to number the people, and I'm going to feel great. I'm just going to count the people, and we're going to feel significant. I'm going to count the people, and I may feel a little bit of pride. I know that's kind of out of line, but it won't be that big of a deal. Ultimately, he orders this census to be conducted because he's made a calculation. If I experience guilt, if I have this unpleasant feeling, the feeling won't be too bad. And so that's why he greenlights it. When I was a kid, I had hair. And when you have hair, you need to go to the barbershop occasionally. And so I went, it was the Indian Trail Barbershop. So you just show up, no appointments. I think it was mandatory to smoke if you went in there, and just a couple of barbers in there. It's almost like Mayberry, except no Floyd. Anyway, I would go, especially like during the school year, most of the time I would go on a Saturday morning, or sometimes maybe after school, but I'd get to my dad would take me to the Indian Trail Barber Shop, and if you went on Saturday, it was not unusual that a Cub Scout or a Boy Scout might show up with a box of Krispy Kreme donuts because they're fundraising, right? So the Girl Scouts have their cookies, the Cub Scouts are going to show up. Well, later they showed up with popcorn, but for a while it was donuts. Anyway, so they would show up at the Indian Trail Barber Shop with these dozen hot donuts, trying to sell those as a fundraiser. Well, Krispy Kreme donuts are good. That's kind of an easy sell. But it's interesting, there was one barber, and he always had the same response. And the answer was this: no, I will not buy your donuts. I mean, come on, this is a kid. You cut his hair. I mean, you could just give the donuts like to us. No, but his response was always, no, I'm not going to buy your donuts, but if you will sit there and eat that dozen, I'll give you $100. And as you weigh that in your mind, many of you, and if you haven't had a hot Krispy Kreme donut, you should do that. I'm telling you, if the children of Israel got that instead of manna, they would not have complained, right? And hot Krispy Kreme donuts are crazy good. And especially, like, if you get a hot Krispy Kreme donut, like, when you start to eat it, it just it's like it dissolves, doesn't it? It's like, where'd it go? Like here and here. But you'd have kids that would take the barber up on this offer because the thought is, eat a dozen of these things. I mean, they go down like nothing. And so you eat the first one, and the first one goes down, and it's like magic. Oh, I could eat 100 of these things. You eat number 2. That's not so bad. You eat number 3, and at that point, these donuts begin to unionize. And I don't know what happens internally, but like somewhere at the 3 point, those things start to swell. And swell in very uncomfortable ways. And you're like, when your arms go, you just start feeling miserable. You get 3, you get 4, you get 5, and you're just starting to feel sick. But there were multiplied occasions where kids would take the barber up on this offer, and they would do so because they thought, well, I'm going to feel full, but I won't feel that bad. I'm just telling you, if you eat a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts, you're going to feel really, really, really bad. But you'll start that, you'll take that bet, you'll take that dare because you're thinking, well, it won't be that bad. Listen, that same type of thinking, that same type of filter applies to our decisions so many times as we are weighing whether or not we're going to obey God. In this case, David is trying to assess whether I'm going to do or operate in the bounds that God has established with something as basic as the conduct of a census. And he decides, well, and again, this is somebody that has adultery and murder in the rearview mirror. This won't be that bad. And if I feel, I know what it's like to feel the guilt of adultery and murder. So there's no way that I'll feel that bad over this. I'm just telling you that consistently, any and every time that you expect sin to be this bad, the guilt to be this much, it's going to be this much worse. The only expectation that you and I need to have with respect to sin is that it is going to be exponentially worse and of greater consequence than you would ever, ever, ever have thought. But we will rationalize and we'll make that decision to disobey God because we make some calculations. Yeah, I might experience guilt, but it won't be that bad. You got teenagers that are young adults that are making decisions with respect to how far they go physically in relationships because they think, well, I won't feel that bad if I cross this line. You have those that are surfing and potentially going to websites on their phones or on their devices thinking, well, I'm not going to feel bad for doing this, or going too far in some interpersonal relationship with someone that's not your spouse. A million times over in so many different circumstances, we are making these assessments and we think, oh, I won't feel that bad. when you come to that conclusion, I'm just telling you, get ready for the worst to happen. Because when you expect the guilt to be bearable, I'm telling you, it will not. David conducts a census and says, I have sinned greatly. Please remove this guilt from me. It was weighing on him like an oppressive ton of bricks. But he came to that decision not only because he expected the guilt to be bearable, same reason that you and I will, but also because we expect the consequences to be nominal. You expect the consequences to be nominal. We did not read what happens next, but if you look in the verses that follow, we're told that God has a prophet go to David and have a conversation. And there's going to be consequences. And the consequences are these. You see them in verse 13. Do you want 3 years of famine to come on your land? So 3 years of famine in whatever form. Or you get 3 months of fleeing from your foes while they pursue you. So enemy armies will chase you for 3 months. 3 years famine, 3 months being chased, or a plague in your land for 3 days. I'm going to tell you what it is, but there'll be a plague 1, 2, 3 days. Consider carefully what answer I should take back. And so David says, I have great anxiety. Please let us fall into the Lord's hands because his mercies are great, but don't let me fall into human hands. Well, in short, the answer effectively is 3 days. It's not going to be 3 years of famine. It's not going to be 3 months of being pursued, but 3 days. 3 days of a plague. And we're told that God sends a plague on Israel from that morning until the appointed time, from Dan to Beersheba, so from tip to tail. And it continues until the Lord says enough. Now, what happens during that 3-day period is that 70,000 people die. 70,000 men died. Now, just for context's sake, the United States lost 58,220 in Vietnam. We were in Vietnam for 12 years. 58,220. They lost 70,000 in 3 days. As people are dying, well, you've got to have funerals, right? And obviously people are going to be affected by this loss. And so as this is occurring, David has to watch this. Almost certainly there's going to be stacks of, not just hundreds of, not just dozens of, but thousands, tens of thousands of funerals that are going on, where people are marching through towns and villages and cities, great and small, with the bodies of their loved ones who have just, out of the blue, they were here this morning but gone tonight, dead. You've got wives that are grieving and just saying, what happened? You've got mothers that are grieving saying, what happened? You've got children that are looking at their father's lifeless bodies and saying, what happened? And they are absolutely grief-stricken. They are absolutely overwhelmed by the enormity and the immensity and the suddenness of this loss. And as David sees that, not one time, not dozens of times, not hundreds of times, but thousands of times, every time he has to see that, what does he have to think? I did this. My order did this. Her husband died because I said this. Her father died because I said this. Your brother died because I did this. Your grandfather died because I issued this order. Time and time and time and time again, David had to think, all of these lives are affected. The entire nation is grieving because I said count them. It seemed to be so small, but the consequence so great. 111 years ago, this coming Saturday, something happened. And a gun was fired by a man whose name was Gavrilo Princip. He was a Bosnian Serb, and he shot a guy named Franz Ferdinand in the neck and killed him. And he shot him in the neck because he was part of a broader conspiracy they didn't like, because Ferdinand was leader of the Austria-Hungary Empire. They didn't like how they had annexed Bosnia. So we're mad. We're gonna shoot the leader. So he does. So 111 years ago, this coming Saturday, he shoots Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the neck. So now you have the Archduke of the Austria-Hungary Empire dead, and understandably, the Austro-Hungarians blamed the Serbs because it was a Bosnian Serb that killed him. So they said, all right, you've done this, here's what's going to happen. You had better accept these terms. And they put some terms out that they knew, candidly, that the Serbs would never agree to. So the Serbs said, we're not going to do that. And so they said, all right, we declare war against you. Well, they declare war against the Serbs, who also happen to be allied with Russia. Well, so that means that Russia all of a sudden is declaring war and joining the fight. Well, Germany was allied with the Austria-Hungary Empire, and they declare war then on Russia. Well, by doing that, Britain and France are also allied with Russia, so they said, we're at war with you. And so begins what we know as World War I, what was initially called the Great War, thinking that it's going to be the greatest experience of the loss of life that's ever been. And to that point, it was the greatest loss of life that had ever been experienced. But in those few short years, and the counting is difficult, but somewhere between 9 and 11 million soldiers on both sides were killed. I think the population of North Carolina is somewhere around 11 million. So if you just all of a sudden deleted North Carolina, I mean, from Manteo to Murphy, every person that you see all of a sudden is dead. 11 million people. But it wasn't just simply that, but the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, and German empires collapse. National boundaries after this get redrawn. World War I ends, maybe you remember, with what was known as the Treaty of Versailles, but the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles were so punitive against Germany that made Adolf Hitler rise in the 30s, late 20s and 30s, made it more likely. It created economic factors that ultimately were significant in bringing about the Great Depression. Created environment that made Adolf Hitler's rise to power almost certain. And there were another 21 to 25 million that died in World War II, to say nothing of the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. All because of a guy on a Sunday morning with one gun and one bullet shoots one guy in the neck. How in the world could that happen? I am certain that he would have never thought, with the squeezing of that trigger, that all of that stuff would have happened. But that's the thing. You never know what those consequences are going to be. And when you evaluate them and you think them to be nominal, and when you think, for example, that it's just physical, it's just a website, it's just a word, it's just a response, it's just this item, it's just this form on my taxes, whatever it is, you can think it to be, the consequences of this are so nominal, and they will be so nominal, it doesn't make any difference if I cross this. I'm just telling you, based on God's word, you are setting yourself up and plenty of other innocent people for woeful misery and consequence. Why? Because when you expect the consequences to be nominal, you cross those lines. The only decision that you made is whether or not you're going to obey God or not. What you have no say-so in is the total number of people that are affected. And almost certainly, and almost always, it is exponentially more than you could have ever guessed. One guy with one bullet effectively launched what you could say are 2 world wars. One guy with a census order cost 70,000 lives. You, I, me, all of us, we are in the process of making decisions on a daily basis. And maybe there are just choices that you are weighing right now, and you are at the crossroads of decision. And it may very well be that you know that God has put a very clear line. This is the boundary that I want you to operate in. And you're very tempted to say, and just cross it. And you may do so because you think, well, I won't feel that bad. So the guilt that I experience, that's no big deal. And whatever consequences, hey, it only affects me. It only affects me. Only I will know. I'm just telling you, if you want to operate with that delusion, I promise you it's going to bite you. It bit David. It bit 70,000 families because of his choice. As you are making choices, you're doing so with expectations. Let those expectations be guided by this truth, that the guilt will be worse than you would ever think, and the consequences far graver than you could have ever anticipated. Will you bow your heads with me?